please excuse any construction noise. I will mute myself when our alumni members are speaking. So I'd like to start us off with introductions. Anna, you are right next to me on the screen. So why don't we start with you and then we can go around. Thanks.
Of course. My name is Ana Villarreal. I'm currently based in Mexico City. I graduated Barnard in 2015, where I double majored in anthropology and urban studies. And well, I studied in London as well after Barnard, and I've worked in a couple different places. But I'm currently based in Mexico City, where I work in the Institute for Transport and Development Policy, ITDP, as a public policy manager, focusing on road safety and sustainable urban transport and development.
Mm. Who'd like to go next? Anyone can jump in.
I'm happy to go next. So my name is Sophie. I graduated from Barnard in 2016. I'm half French, half American. Grew up in Paris until I was 9 and then moved to Montana from 9 to 18 before starting my studies at Barnard. And I majored in translation and then did a master's right away at the Columbia Teachers College in bilingual education. And while I was between my years of master's, I reached out to all the Columbia and Barnard alumni in Paris to look for an internship. I told them I was looking for an internship in French and English. I wanted to work with people. And I got a response back from a woman who right away told me I should work at this business school in Paris called HEC Paris. It's the #1 business school in Europe. And I have been there now almost 5 years with a lot of career development within the business school. So that's where I'm at right now.
Well, I'll pick that thread up. Since the first time I moved to Europe, I moved to Paris. I took a gap year and then I transferred from Connecticut College to Barnard and graduated in 1987. And so Lisa Donoughe, and I'm sort of an outlier here, I think, a little bit, because my move to Europe was a career pivot. So I had a 30-year career doing strategic communications in public relations in food and beverage, and then made a deliberate switch to move from consumer marketing, which wasn't really satisfying my soul anymore, to the arts. And I now work as the lead international marketing and development person at a small independent German film and television company in Berlin called New Film Productions. We mostly make German public television documentary and scripted shows.
Nice. I'm actually going to be in Berlin next week, so I feel like it's a good time to pick up.
Give me a call.
You can't hear me? Great.
No, give me a
second.
call. No.
Give you a call. Okay, good. Great. So I am Tova. I graduated Barnard in 2017, majored in English and creative writing. Right after, I would say, like, graduated May, moved to Israel in August. Since I moved here, I've been working in content marketing. Right now, I'm a content marketing manager at a company called Monday.com. We have a Subway campaign running right now, so you guys may have seen some of those. When I was at Barnard, I also studied at UCL for one semester of my junior year. And that's about it for me.
And then I still haven't gone. I'm Sidney. I graduated pretty recently last year in 2021. I majored in medical anthropology, and then I was also on the pre-med track. And while I was a senior at Barnard, I applied for the Princeton and Latin America Fellowship, which I ended up doing in Costa Rica. So I was at Earth University in Costa Rica. It's a sustainable agriculture and food systems university. And I worked there in their Earth Ventures office, where we worked on creating different sustainable business ventures for the university. And I was there for the year. Also lived part of the time in Chile and did the fellowship remotely. from there. And then I've recently applied for a Fulbright to go back and return next year to do an archaeological research project again with Earth University and also with the National Museum of Costa Rica. But right now I'm back in New York at the moment. And yeah, excited to be part of this panel.
There's so many fun ties and links here. Hi, I'm Shoshana. I graduated from Barnard in 2018. I studied sociology and was also on the pre-med track. So as you will probably hear, my study abroad after university led me to do quite a career change. I'm currently at the London School of Economics and I live in London. And I am in the health policy department there, doing my PhD in medical sociology. But I came to the UK after Barnard to do my master's at the University of Cambridge. And because of that experience, decided actually the UK felt very much like home. And so I was excited about it. And one thing led to another during COVID, and I decided to come here and be here full time. After my PhD, I plan to do clinical training in psychoanalysis here in London.
Very nice. Thank you all so much. We have such a wide range of industries and fields, which I think will be so helpful for our students today. Just building off of the introductions, I wanted to ask, how did you decide to pursue work opportunities and or graduate education outside the US? What was the starting point there? And anyone can jump in.
I can start. I think it was like I said in my introduction, I'm half French, half American, but I had done most of my middle school, high school, and then college and master's in the US. So I would come back to France in the summers, but I didn't feel like I'd really cultivated much of my French side, and I wanted to be able to work in French and English. So it seemed kind of a natural next step. And for anyone who's thinking about starting a career abroad, I'd say my biggest piece of advice is give it 3 years. I think maybe we all even felt that in college, that it was like first year is exciting but tough. Second year it's even more like that. And then you start to get the swing of things and you start to create your community and get into a rhythm. So I would say there might be rocky times in those first 3 years, but it's really, I gave myself that 3-year mark as my point of assessment on how I'm doing in my personal life and professional life. And I think that was really important to give myself time to develop that life when you're, moving abroad and might not have family connections and a network there to support you. So that's why I chose to be in France.
Yeah, that 3-year advice was very similar to what I was going to say. When I was at Barnard, I was finishing up and I had every intention of going to medical school, and I was looking to take a gap year, and I liked school. So I figured maybe I should do a master's and kind of do a year of intentional learning about the work that I was doing my senior thesis on at the time. And then I read about this opportunity to study with a CERN professor at the University of Cambridge and applied. And it ended up being a very fortuitous experience because I ended up loving England. And at the end of that 10-month period, part of me felt like I wanted to spend more time committing myself to the experience of living abroad. I didn't know that. It took me a year to figure that out amidst COVID. I think I had a lot of learning to do about what I wanted to spend my time doing professionally. But 100%, I agree with Sophie. The time that I've given myself to adapt to England, which I think in part is very different because it's a very different culture, but the same language is spoken here. And so I think that helped a lot. But you give yourself time to develop community and learn the ups and downs of living abroad. And if anyone's thinking about graduate school, schooling and education and the way it's thought about here is very, very different. And so navigating those nuances was a big part of that choice to stay.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Lisa, please.
For me, place has played a big role in my emotional well-being and kind of my stages of life. And so for the first 10 years of my career, New York really was the energy, matched my energy level in my 20s. And then I got to a point in my career where I wanted more green and a different value system. So I moved to Portland, Oregon, which was wonderful. And then I got to a point, as I said, where I wanted to really do a career pivot. And so expanding and living outside of a capitalist society, living in the EU, particularly in Germany, I feel more human and less like a consumer. So for me, it's an internal journey where the place and environment and stimulus and community has really, I've looked to build a life where the outside matches the inside. So yeah, that's how I got to Berlin.
Yeah, I think in my case, similar to Sophie, I also had a bit of an international upbringing. So I'm Mexican. I was born and raised in Mexico, but I attended a lot of international schools and also lived in Paris for a bit and then finished high school in New York before attending Barnard. And then by the time I graduated Barnard, I really liked the field that I studied. I love cities and really wanted to see how I could improve living conditions in cities. And always I had this experience from growing up in Mexico and Mexico City and all the challenges there. And by the time I graduated, I was looking at what to do next if I wanted to come back to Mexico and work there. And then I was looking at different opportunities and I found a really cool master's program, actually at LSE as well. And it was exactly what I wanted to study. It was it's called City Design and Social Science, but it's this relationship between the built environment and how people interact. And sociology. So it was very interesting and I just went for it as well. So I think just like looking around and see what opportunities there are. And by that time, I think I'd spent 6 years in New York. I kind of wanted to have that new experience of living somewhere else and having another culture and living in a different city. Just kind of that experience of meeting people from different countries as well was very attractive to me.
Yeah, for me, definitely it was the part of the world that really appealed to me. You know, I grew up, I have family from Chile. I also studied abroad in Cuba my junior year. So I knew that I wanted to return and continue to work in Latin America. So it was really, you know, finding this fellowship where I could go and, you know, whatever placement I was in, I was going to be within that part of the world. And, you know, I wanted an opportunity to really work and live in Spanish. And so identifying that as something that I wanted, and then, you know, so many unexpected, wonderful things came out of that experience. And I think, you know, that was one of the best things is you go into it thinking you want all of these things, and then you find so much more because you're in such a new, different place. And yeah, so I think definitely, you know, thinking about where you might want to go to work or live, thinking about the part of the world that you might want to be in is definitely very helpful for trying to narrow it down.
Yeah, I want to say just for a moment, like how much I miss being in spaces of Barnard people, just because this is like such a remarkable group of people. I'm really, really honored to be a part of it. So thank you. Second of all, it's interesting because I'm like not really the kind of person who's very emotionally driven. I really, really like logic, but probably one of the biggest points of clarity in my life is that I always wanted to live in Israel and that I'm in the right place. I think where that like butts heads against logic is that it's a different language. It's an entirely different culture. So I think in a lot of ways, it's not that I decided to work somewhere else. It's that I decided to kind of follow where I had clarity and then let the rest of the pieces fall into place, which goes against my nature pretty strongly. But thank God really, really worked out with a lot of kind of flexibility and learning to go with the flow, and definitely, you know, a lot of hard work. I definitely resonate with what a few people have said about giving it time and, you know, making sure that you're not just ruling out a decision that you've already made because it's hard, but really, really pushing through and leaning on the people who can support you, but giving it time and space that it needs.
Wonderful. I feel like we're hearing a lot about experiences of both studying and working outside the US. So I'm actually going to smush these next two questions together. For those who have studied outside of the US, and it seems like all of you guys have experience with studying and working outside the US once again. So how would you characterize differences between higher education in the US and the country of your graduate studies? And same question, how would you characterize differences between your work culture in the US and your current country? And like our previous question, feel free to jump in.
I can pop in. I think about this all the time. So I guess when it comes to school, and I've only studied and worked abroad in the UK. When it comes to school, I found, starting with my master's program, that the United Kingdom approaches education very intensely, but in a very self-driven way by the time you're in graduate school. So by the time I had entered my master's program, I was amongst a lot of people who were very self-selecting and deliberate as to why they wanted to study, because the structure of English education from when you're little is very one-on-one. They have a tutorial system here. It's very small, like group gatherings. And so there's a lot of self-driven learning, and that threw me off course. It threw me that there wasn't a typical class schedule that I was very, very used to. And I found that there was something in the school education, the school culture, university culture, where I sensed, and maybe it was because I had spent a lot of my undergraduate education working very, very hard at my academics, that I had an opportunity to create some kind of academic work-life balance for myself. Moving to London, I've realized that this city has a lot of people who work a lot, but there's a saying here where people work to live and they don't live to work. I'm from New York, I'm a New Yorker, and that is not the way it is in New York City. And I have been very, very, very attracted to that culture. So I think it exists both in the educational space here and in the work professional space. And Lisa had mentioned that Berlin, there's a culture of, it's very anti-capitalist, that, you create a life externally that you want for yourself internally. And I do sense that even in London, as though it's kind of like this middle ground place. And it's something that's become really, really important to me.
Yeah, I have to say, I totally agree with Shoshana, because I'm not a New Yorker, but I lived there. So for the 4 years of bachelor's and 2 years of master's, and I think coming from New York to Europe, where it's like when you meet people, I mean, there are definitely times you talk a little bit about your career, but it's more like what you do, who you are outside of that. And it's very much about work-life balance. And I think that I feel very fulfilled in my career, but I feel like I've been able to work on everything around that a lot in my life in Europe, where I think in the US, we're never really forced to stop because things are always open, things are always moving, especially in New York. And here, like when I first moved to Paris, and I'm half French and I grew up in Paris, I should have known this, but when the grocery stores were all closed on Sunday, I just had this moment of panic, like this was my day to like get stuff done, but actually it's just kind of more of a real rest day. So just little things that you get used to that you very much appreciate in that as well. Yeah. And I'd say, just going back to like studying in Europe, I think I work in a business school and we really are focused on practical pedagogy. So bringing in a lot of professionals to teach you very, very practically what it is we're also theoretically introducing. And I think that one thing I would give as advice, if anyone loves to talk to people, meet new people, think critically, maybe even present. I was studying translation and I never would have thought like business school for my post college studies. And there are a lot of master's programs or other continued education programs that don't necessarily require you to have studied econ or finance and like, so now I'm like the director of sales. And I feel like Barnard definitely prepared me to be able to go into sales. And it wasn't really something I would have, applied for directly out of Barnard. So I think just trust the skills that Barnard is teaching you now, which are incredibly good soft skills, and you'll be able to apply that to a lot of different things after. So just be super open-minded in what you think your careers are or can be after your bachelor's.
Yeah, on the same note as Sophie, on the first half about kind of how people introduce themselves, I've noticed that, I don't know if you can hear the dogs in the background of my building, I hope not. I've noticed that, in America, when people introduce themselves on panels, they start with their professional experience and that kind of thing. Here, always, people start with, hello, my name is X, I am a father to Y and Z and whatever it is. And that really goes first in a way that I think is a little bit alarming to Americans. And I know that we work with offices around the world, and that's kind of like a bit of the culture that's permeated. I think one really interesting thing that can be a big challenge for people who come from backgrounds like ours is that the education to professional system is pretty different in the sense that people are super duper trained. You don't go into liberal arts, you go into the exact degree of the career that you intend to have, and you get work experience so that when they hire here, they're not looking at like Columbia did like a little bit, but not that much. Like it may have gotten my foot in the door, but I've heard from people in America that it's a lot more powerful in the process, as opposed to here, where I think that it's a lot more of that work experience and really proving your skills. On that note, one thing that I did when I got here was just networked like crazy. I did a search on LinkedIn of Barnard alumni who were working in marketing in Israel, which by the way is a weirdly large number, and found people and said, can you meet for coffee? And the worst thing that could possibly happen was that people said, nice to meet you, but I'm sorry, I don't have time. And the best thing was that I learned from a lot of them. A lot of the things that you're not going to know inherently, you can learn from coffee, whether it's virtual or whatever it is, with these people, again, whether they're Barnard alumni or whatever it is. And the third thing I would say is this idea of, it's an Israeli concept called zorem, which is like to go with the flow. Again, very difficult for me, but there is a large amount of it in this culture of, don't always like push against things, but kind of see how you can work with it, which I think is a pretty good life skill, and I'm happy to take that one on.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Tova said, especially here in Mexico. When you graduate university, you're very focused from the beginning, like you're going to be a lawyer or you're going to medical school. Like they start specializing very early on. And I think whenever I introduce myself and my background, they get a bit confused because I have this multidisciplinary background and it doesn't quite fit within these categories, but it's been so useful in my everyday life, and just a lot of the soft skills that Barnard gave me, just like critical thinking and being able to write and research, that's been incredibly helpful in a lot of my roles, and especially in the field that I'm working. And I think most every field, being able to kind of have these multidisciplinary perspectives and be able to communicate with people from different backgrounds and kind of find those common grounds and how you can apply concepts or methodologies from different sectors into your own, that's been incredibly helpful. And that flexibility very much comes from Barnard and what I learned from my classes and kind of that education that I had. Also, the part about networking is really, really important as well. Coming from a Latin American context, network and who you know and how you establish relationships with your peers is very, very important. And a lot of the things usually to move projects ahead is to be able to establish a good relationship with your counterpart and being able to talk to them. And it's kind of like a more informal, soft skill of how you manage your own resources and the relationships that you have as well.
Yeah, and definitely adding on to what Tova was saying also before about just, having this space and even like meetings and things to talk about your personal life and sort of hear what people's weekends were like and, hear about how their families are doing. And I found a lot that in Costa Rica, like people genuinely cared about that and took the time to really hear about it. It wasn't, oh, how was your weekend? Oh, good. And then, you move right into the meeting. There would be that nice sort of 10-15 minute amount of time where you could actually really talk and hear about how people were doing. It was nice to be able to go for lunch at my boss's house and, be with his wife and his kids and that sort of thing that I hadn't experienced before in the US. And I think also definitely I was working at a very international university. So there were faculty members from the US, faculty members from different countries in South America, Central America, a lot of students from Africa as well, students from all around. And so being in that sort of environment, I think was also very special for working abroad and being around, people that weren't just from Costa Rica, but were from around the world. And I really valued having that type of environment because everyone followed, a Costa Rican work schedule and a lot of sort of the just different working relationships that exist in Costa Rica. But having that international perspective as well, something that was really wonderful for myself as well as I was adjusting to a really different work environment.
I started this experience in Berlin as a sabbatical, and partly because I have an Irish passport. I'm a dual citizen. My grandmother was born in Ireland, and they have a 2-generation citizenship program where you're eligible for an Irish passport. And during that sabbatical, I decided to go to a Berlin Community College, an amazing program they have, which is an integration program, which is a 9-month, 5-hour language course a day, 5 days a week, so 25 hours a week I spent with mostly refugees from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it was just an outrageously fascinating, humbling, just beautiful experience. But one day, this was so non-American. The teacher, to show us, he was the curriculum that day was learning about how the tax system works in Germany. He passed around his actual pay stub, and so which is something Americans would never typically do. And so that was that I've noticed over the last 5 years that I've lived in Berlin that there is a different attitude about money and how much you make. It can be very casually dropped in conversation with friends, how much you make. So that's quite interesting. But on the work side, I would say in our company, which has been around since 1956, we're about a very small kind of mid company, 75 employees. There is not the same degree of entrepreneurialism that I've experienced working in the US. There's not that same, I miss it some days. I just want to get things done and make things happen, but we definitely operate at a slower pace.
Wonderful. Just building off of the thread that we've started here, what advice would you give to current students who are wondering about acclimating to a new culture as a graduate student or professional? And just tagging on one more question here, have you noticed ways in which you have come to express aspects of your identity differently outside of the US?
I actually love this question, so I'd love to take a swing at it. I think, first of all, the best piece of advice I got when I was trying to learn Hebrew was that I can't learn it without sounding stupid. And this reminds me a bit of, I'm obsessed with Brene Brown in general, if anybody else here likes her. But she has this thing about, when you go out of your comfort zone, you will fail. And it's not that you might, it's that you will. And that's exactly how I feel about acclimating to culture, about learning a language, is that you will, I'm I'd like to make this statement that you will not learn, you will not acclimate without feeling like a fish out of water. If you don't get yourself to that point, you're not going to get there, which is so, so hard, but it requires a lot of vulnerability that I think, in my experience, is really rewarding. I think that being an English speaker, especially, by the way, an English speaking writer in another country, can be kind of tricky, because then they want you to do the things that are just all English, as opposed to, you know, your skill set, and you want to be helpful, but you also don't necessarily want to be pigeonholed. And so that can be kind of tricky, where you're going to want to establish yourself as somebody who has a really strong skill set that's not just, I speak English. And that being said, it can get you a little bit ahead. And the third thought that I had on this matter is that it can be really, really fascinating and in some ways poetic to have a mixed identity. I think that the moment that you call someone somewhere else home, you start to become a bit of a hybrid being. And in some ways that can feel a little bit, you know, strange, like you don't belong in one place or another. I can tell you that my English is getting worse and my Hebrew's not there yet. So we're just not having any language skills these days. But there is something really beautiful and fascinating and rewarding about that.
I love that insight. I often call this choice I've made mandatory vulnerability. As someone that's fiercely independent, I started and had my own company for 20 years. This is such a great spiritual opportunity for growth. I use my Americanism sometimes as a strong, like, secret weapon at work, because there is a culture of letting the elder, and I don't mean to say this as a sexist comment about my company, but there is, the management team is all male and they're a little older, and typically folks let the managers talk and talk and talk and talk, and I will just use my American identity to interrupt and kind of, you know, be the naive person in the room. So I think, and I heard a few of you, I think, have cultural anthropology degrees, medical anthropology. I have a cultural anthropology degree from Barnard. And so so I am used to thinking about culture, but what I found in this integration course is it really broke everything down for me. And I learned that everything is culture. Even learning is culture. I had a conflict with a fellow student who was from Morocco, and she was learning the way that she and her fellow students were learning is they talked the entire class. And the Polish and the British and the American, all sort of the northern countries, we didn't understand or relate to that. There was a conflict there, and I had a conversation with the instructor one afternoon, and she said, "Listen, you have to understand that that's how they're going to be successful. That's how they learn. And so you have to be in a place of acceptance and understanding." And so for me, the identity side of your question, this is such a great question. It's so complex. The answer, we could talk about this question for a lot longer. I've learned that everything is culture. And so it has allowed me to slow down, be more open, and listen and understand and ask more questions.
Yeah, I have to say, I totally agree. I think there are a lot of great things about the American school system that instills a lot of confidence. And I think the most important thing you can bring with you in your job or career outside of the US is that confidence, knowing like what you can ask for. Like I asked for a job creation in my company, and then I told them, like, I think you need to create this job because of these reasons. And I also think I'm the best person for the job. So I'll explain to you why now in my presentation. He goes, it was a French manager. He's like, wow, you really have to like Americans because they've got a lot of confidence. And sometimes it can, you just got to try it, because it's, I don't think it's not something that a lot of Europeans are used to, that confidence of knowing what you're worth, knowing what you can ask for, and just going for it. Because like the worst thing someone can tell you is no. And I think that that's being a really challenging environment at Barnard. You just kind of realize like you just have to try and challenge yourself. And so I think that yeah, it's something that you should definitely bring with you to your career abroad. And then I would say that the three things that really helped me kind of create something here was knowing really what the three things I wanted in my life in Paris, like more specifically for my career. It was just like, I knew I might not find the perfect job right away, but as long as I was trying to find a job that had these three things, which was speaking in French and English, working in a team, and being kind of in a presentation role, whatever that was going to be, if it ticked those three boxes, then I was going to definitely be learning, and at least something that I enjoyed. And that was what I put in my message going out to all of the alumni from Barnard in Paris. I said, I want to work in French. So I wasn't saying like, hey, I saw you have this job in your company. I was just like, this is what I'm looking for in Paris. Do you know anyone offering internships or jobs that sound like this, or that could offer this? So I'd say like in your studies now, just think, what are really the three main things that you're looking for? And this, like whatever I'm saying about your career, could be for your new life, your social life abroad. And I think that role can definitely apply to that.
Yeah, and I think for me, oh, sorry. Was someone about to go?
You guys.
I think, okay. I think a big for me also was, I lived for part of this past year in Chile. I was there for about 6 months. And I had been there before just to visit family. I have a lot of family there. And I think, one of the things is realizing that it's so different visiting a place versus living there. And also realizing that, even though I did have these family ties there, that I was a foreigner and, didn't know what it was like to live there. And so I had to learn all of that. And so I think just giving the space to really learn that and reconcile like your identity in a space that maybe you've been to before, and maybe you already have ties to, but that now you're living in, was just a huge process of my life abroad for those 6 months. And I think also I'm proposing to do a research project right now where I go back to Costa Rica and do an archaeological study. And a big part in thinking about that, again, is thinking about, with this sort of community inclusion work that I want to do, what it means to be a foreigner that's doing this work, and what it means to acknowledge my positionality as such, and take a step back and listen to what other people are saying who are from the place that I'll be hopefully working in. And I think that was just a huge part in general of living abroad, is taking that space to listen and acknowledging that you're not from the place, and it takes a while to get used to wherever you're going to be. And I think also saying yes to things was really pivotal for me, just becoming like someone who someone would invite me to something and I would say, oh yeah, of course, no matter what it was very helpful for getting used to living in a new place. But it can be challenging, because you come from a place, like coming from Barnard, and I grew up in the city where you have just already this whole network of people and friends and school and everything, and going into a completely new environment. It's a lot, but you do get used to it.
I can go. I mean, it's tricky. When I was at Barnard, I had a plan. Like I had a very clear plan, and I think a lot of women at Barnard have plans. And moving abroad and becoming an expat, sometimes it feels like a very intentional choice, but other time it just sometimes feels like life is happening. What I mean by that is, I guess my advice is be intentional, but also open-minded, because I had a plan and then certain things happened, including the world flipping on its head and us going through a global pandemic. And I realized that I wanted to make some serious lifestyle and professional changes. I'm not saying a pandemic needs to happen for that to be a, the change in your life. But I came here for school, and I figured, you know what, in 3-4 years, maybe I'll move back. But then I met my partner, and he's English, and now we live together. And so these things just start happening where step by step, you start developing your life in another place. And I would say, the hardest thing about living abroad for me is I live in a different country than my family. And that is a very deliberate choice that I had to make, and I still struggle with, day after day. But the more I've given it time to, make friends, develop relationships, think about what excites me about being an expat, the more I realized, oh, I really like this part of my identity. I had an absolutely bizarre experience where over the weekend, I went with a group of friends to a football, that's what they call it here, but it's soccer, match between England and America's women's football teams. And I cheered for England because that is the soccer team that I've been supporting. I had never watched soccer before growing up. And I was sitting there cheering for England right after the American national anthem. And it may sound a little bit silly, but it was one of the most bizarre, out of identity experiences that I've had in a very long time. But it also felt completely normal because I'll never be English. I mean, the accent is obvious, but I'm developing an identity as an expat who very much lives in this country, and that's very cool and exciting. But it's those little moments that you start to realize, oh, I'm living my day-to-day here, and this is starting to feel right, even despite certain hurdles.
Yeah, I think I'll echo a lot of what the other panelists have also said. Whenever you move to a new country or a new city, there's always a learning curve, and there's always kind of this, you're getting used to the environment and you're learning as well. And I would say just be patient with yourself. Don't take things too seriously. And as Tova said, if you're speaking another language, you're going to have an accent, you're not going to speak it perfectly. But the way to get better is to practice it. And it's just, you need to get out there and be open-minded about different experiences, and especially working in other countries. I think just being respectful and open-minded and wanting to learn. I think generally people are really happy to share with you their own cultures and experiences. And it's just about showing that willingness to learn and that back and forth and give and take. I think that's kind of the key to it. And yeah, identity is always, that's a loaded question. It's a very big thing. But for example, in my case, I was Mexican, and coming back to Mexico, I very much had that feeling where I was coming back home, and I was very excited to be back in my native culture in a sense. But I'd lived abroad for a lot of years. I lived in New York for 6 years at least, and you're changed by that as well. So I definitely had reverse culture shock when I came back to Mexico. And that's kind of different parts of your identity that you get to express at different times, so that make you who you are and enrich your experiences as well. And just being able to recognize that as well. Now I am Mexican, but I'm also Mexican who has worked abroad and that has had a lot of opportunities and that a lot of my, for example, my coworkers or my friends haven't had. And it's just being able to recognize that privilege as well, and being able to kind of create these bridges. I work in an international NGO, so being able to have those different bridges between different cultures and speaking to different backgrounds is really, it's lovely. I love it.
Thank you so much for sharing. We're approaching the last 10 minutes of our program here. I'd like to invite students, encourage students to share their questions. You can drop your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask any question that you might have to our panelists.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm sorry for background noise. I'm enjoying this conversation at lunch. I'm curious to know if your thank you so much, by the way, for sharing all of your wonderful insight on your time abroad. I was wondering, has your idea of success changed now that you're not in the US? And in terms of, like capitalistic ideals that is instilled in us being in the US versus abroad. Yeah.
I would say for sure that was one of the hardest things, because I think in the US a lot of success is linked to your financial situation, and that was something I really had a hard time figuring out once I got here, is how much should I be asking for in my new jobs. And it is really difficult to find that out, and I went on all the sites and everything. So I would say use your alumni network to ask those questions. Like, ask people on LinkedIn and just be like, hey, I don't really know what like the Spanish market like average salary is, can you just give me ideas? Because it's like very challenging when you're leaving that your country to try to figure that out. So I think for me, success was very monetary when I was back in the US, and now it's become I've definitely stopped comparing my salary, which has my salary gives me everything I need and most of what I want. But compared to the US, is not at all in the same sphere. But when I go to the doctor here, it's all paid for. When I travel, I can go to Spain on a train, and it's super affordable. So there are a lot of advantages to living in when you're looking at it's important to look at the full picture, because although your salary might not be as significant as back in the US, there are a ton of advantages, financial advantages to being in Europe specifically. So I'd say look into the full picture when you're trying to figure out what your life would look like in that country, rent and all that stuff included.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I would say also pace is super different here. In the sense that I got here and I was, I don't know, however old I was when I graduated Barnard, and I was, freaking out that I didn't have a job, and I got a job and I was super gunning for promotion and all that stuff. And life moves a lot. I don't want to say slower, but I would say chiller here, where people don't graduate university until like maybe 27. By the time they get there, then they're kind of figuring themselves out. It's actually pretty common for people here to go into the minus in their bank accounts, because there's like a big, a lot more of a value for like living your life and kind of dealing with it later, which I don't really intend to pick up, but is kind of part of a larger culture here that, on the one hand, I think I'll always be more American in that sense, that I'm always pushing and pushing. And I think that has a lot to do with whether it's American, New York, or Tova, I think that's just kind of always going to be there. And at the same time, there kind of has been this like many moments of, oh, I'm okay where I am. And I can kind of soak in where I am right now.
Great. We have a few questions in the chat here, and we have 3 questions that are in the same thread, so I'm going to kind of smush them together just in the interest of time. So what platforms and resources did you use to search for jobs abroad, especially right after college? And just to tag another question along with that, how do you navigate looking for jobs in countries where you don't speak the native language fluently?
Well, I can't speak to the second one because I'm in England. But cold emailing became my best friend very early on in this process. One of the things about studying for graduate school in England is that it's really all about your supervisor. If there's anyone on this call who is thinking about coming to study and do graduate school in England, and I'm sure it's the same in some of the other countries in Europe, your relationship with your supervisor is very, very important. And it's basically what needs to happen even before you get accepted into your program. And so being able to email somebody whose work you may have read, if any of you are seniors and you're doing your theses and you've realized, oh, this person's name is coming up in every single bibliography that I've been reading through, those are people who you should consider actually emailing. Academics are actually pretty responsive depending on who you're emailing. And that could be a whole panel in and of itself. But that's where I'll start. I don't know if I would call LinkedIn the space for academia, even though academics have them. But definitely start with emails, and definitely start with talking to people who have potentially done the graduate program that you're looking at, and they might be Barnard alums. This person I talked to about doing my master's at Cambridge was not a Barnard alum, but I said, you know, could he help me navigate this application process? And that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, I think for me, just the starting with a fellowship was really helpful. The Barnard Fellowship Office is awesome. I think Dana is on this call, but it was just great for sort of starting to work abroad and having kind of a more set program. It was, you know, largely very independent, but having a more set program to help connect me at first with people and companies and different organizations abroad. And then I think starting with that, I've been able to start to grow a network of people. And so definitely, you know, although it's normally only a year-long opportunity, it's a good way to get started with international work. It feels, you know, a bit more familiar with the whole application process and things. And yeah.
I can't speak to the platform or looking for a job because that's not my experience in how I landed this role, but I do have a belief that my whole career and educational path was built one person at a time. And so often there is one person that you spend time with, that you build a friendship with. In my case, it's a Barnard alum who in Portland started a amazing arts organization called Boom Arts, Ruth Luker, and I was on her board, and I was sitting at a board meeting. This is 6 years ago. And I looked at one of the board members and I thought, oh, wow, Aaron, your husband's from Berlin. I bet you guys have a German tutor. And that introduction to that German tutor led me directly to an introduction to the owner of this company. And I wound up in this amazing role. So I think one thing to keep in mind is really invest in your passions, whatever you're interested in. And sometimes magic can occur that network can actually be an amazing resource for helping build the bridge to the next step.
I'd echo that for sure. I think a really important point is that it probably differs by location. So for example, I found my first job through a Facebook group. I don't know how popular that is in different countries, but that is something where if you're going to speak to somebody who's moving to Israel, then they can tell you, you know, these are the specific Facebook groups to join if you are an English speaker in Israel. And I think that every country is going to have their own, you know, very niche experience of being an expat, of finding a job. And so I would say that's a really important layer, is to ask people from the place that you're moving to.
We are reaching the end of our time with our program. I just want to thank our panelists again for joining us today and just providing such thoughtful insight. A reminder to all of our registrants that you will be getting a recording of this event post 2 o'clock. And we hope to see you at our next Career Insights. And to our panelists, Amanda and I will be in touch. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Let me know if you're in Berlin.
Will do. Thank you. Are you giving them our like names, or like, I'm happy to answer more questions if people have.
Great.
Oh,
yeah, thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll send a message, a thank you to everybody all together, so you all have each other's contact info too, if you want
Great,
to
thank you.
look it up. Lisa, I'll let you know next time I make it to Berlin.
Oh yes, please do.
Hopefully soon.
Coffee
All right,
wine.
thanks everyone so much. Have a great day.
Great
Thanks for
you.
organizing.
Great job, Jihan. Nice to meet you.
Thank
Amanda.
you so much. Nice to meet you all.
Guys.
Bye.